So now that we also learned about functions, I want to give you another opportunity to practice what you learned. And for this, I'm back here in this profit calculator, which we built in an earlier exercise. And attached, you find my code snapshot here, so that you can use that if you did not do that past exercise. And my task for you here in this profit calculator is now that you replace this code here with a custom function that should output some text and then wait for the user to enter some text and then return that entered value. And then in the main function, you should call that new function that gets user input and store the result in one of these variables. And then you should also outsource these calculations into a single standalone function that should perform all three calculations and return all three values. Now, definitely try this on your own first. Thereafter, we'll do this together. So, did you succeed? Let's do this together now. And I will start with a function that gets the user input for different values, so for different text. For that, we can define a new function here, and I'll name it getUserInput. Though, of course, the name is up to you. It just should be descriptive and describe what this function will do, so which kind of operation will be performed. And then in here, I want to execute this code. So I'll copy that code and use that in here. Now that text, of course, should be dynamic. Every time this function gets called, this text will be different, since I'll fetch different pieces of user input. And therefore, I'll accept a parameter here, which I'll name infoText. The name, of course, is up to you, but it should be of type string. And I'll then print this infoText here. Now, regarding getting that user input, we need that special pointer value. But that's not a big problem because we can simply create a variable here. Let's say a user input variable, which should be of type float64 because that's what we'll need later. So here, I'll set this to float64. And then it's this user input variable, which I'll use instead of revenue here. So that user input will be set by scan. And therefore here, after calling scan, we can return that fetched user input, which is a float64 value. Now, as you learned, you need to let go know about your intentions though, and if I plan to return a float64 value as I do here, I therefore have to add float64 here as a return type annotation after this parameter list and name. But with that, we can now call this function and replace this code here with our function call. And here, I then pass the revenue infoText to get user input. Now, the way we wrote this function will then get back that user input as a value, and therefore we can then store that in this revenue variable, which I declared here. Alternatively, we can now also use this short declaration and assignment form here and get rid of that separate declaration here. And now this can be repeated for expenses and tax rate. So here I'll actually comment out expenses and instead set expenses here equal to get user input with expenses passed as an infoText to this function. And then I'll do the same for the tax rate. And set tax rate equal to get user input, asking for the tax rate here. And with that, we can also get rid of this code here. So with that, we got these variables, and actually we can also get rid of this code here to make this even more concise. And we can now work on that second function you should create, a function that performs these calculations. So for that, I'll add another function here, and it doesn't matter if I do that before or after get user input. Here, to have it all on the same screen, I'll do it before get user input, and I'll name this function calculate financials. because we'll calculate multiple numbers here. To be precise, these financials here. Therefore, we can actually cut that code and paste that in here, and then make sure that the required data, revenue, expenses, and tax rate, is received in here. So therefore, we have to accept parameters, revenue, expenses, and tax rate, and since they will all be of the same value type, I'll simply separate them by commas with that and add the type once after that list. In this case, float 64. With that, we calculate all these values. Now we can return them. So as a first step, we should let go no about the fact that we'll return multiple float values here, and therefore I'll add a pair of parentheses after this parameter list here and add 3 times float 64 in there. Now, as you learned, we could also give the return values names here, but here in this exercise I won't do it. If you did it, that's of course absolutely fine. Here I'll just specify the types, and then we can return EBT, profit, and ratio like this. The order is up to you, but you should of course keep that order in mind when you then call this function and you use the returned values. Which I'll do now, here in the main function. I'll call calculate financials, pass my revenue, expenses, and tax rate to this function, and as a result, we'll get back the EBT, profit, and that ratio. And since these are all new variables here, because of scoping, we're not using these ones, but we're creating new ones here in the main function, we have to declare them, and here I'll therefore use this declaration and assignment shortcut. And that's it. That should give us a Go program that can be executed that now uses some custom functions. So therefore here, if we now run this application, this program here, we can enter some revenue, our expenses here, and a tax rate, and we'll get back our result here. Now, as a little bonus, we can also work on the formatting of that number here, even though that was not a task of this exercise. You can of course still do it now and pause the video. Here, I will make sure that the output is properly formatted by not using println, but instead printf, about which you also learned. And then here, I'll output the value for the EBT. Though, since it's a float, we could actually also output this in a formatted way, and for example, make sure that we have at most one decimal place that's being output. And I'll do the same here for the profit with %.1f, and then referring to the profit, and also the ratio. Here, however, I don't just want to output one decimal sign, but instead, let's say 3 or something like that. And with that little bonus added here, if we run this application again, we can enter our data here, and we get that output. Now the line breaks are missing, so we should add them by adding this special \n line break identifier. And with that, we can re-execute this, enter our data, and now we got this all nicely formatted according to our rules here.